I was working the closing shift at Starbucks one night, and I was the only one in the store. It was a quiet night, and I was starting to get bored. I was cleaning up the counter when I heard a noise coming from the back room. I went to investigate, and I saw a figure standing in the shadows. I couldn't make out who it was, but I could tell that it was tall and thin. I called out to the figure, but it didn't move. I started to feel scared, and I backed away slowly. The figure didn't follow me, but it didn't move either. I stood there for a few minutes, not knowing what to do. Finally, I decided to turn and run. I ran out of the back room and into the front of the store. I grabbed my coat and bag and ran out the door. I didn't stop running until I was a few blocks away from the Starbucks. I was shaking and scared, and I didn't know what had just happened. I went home and told my roommate what had happened, but she didn't believe me. She said that I was just imagining things because I was tired. But I know what I saw. I know that there was something in that back room, and I'm never going back to that Starbucks again. I still think about that night sometimes, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run away. I'm glad that I'm safe, but I'll never forget what I saw in that back room. I was never one to believe in the supernatural, but my visit to the local Starbucks one crisp autumn evening would shatter my skepticism forever. It was a story I felt compelled to share, a haunting that would forever change my perception of reality. The cafe was my go-to spot for studying. Its warm, welcoming atmosphere and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee providing the perfect backdrop for concentration. That evening, I settled into my usual corner, my laptop open and textbooks spread out before me. As the evening progressed, I noticed the cafe had grown unusually quiet. The chatter of customers had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that settled like a heavy fog. I glanced around, but the other patrons seemed engrossed in their laptops or books, oblivious to the strange atmosphere. I tried to shake off my unease and focused on my work, but then a series of inexplicable events unfolded. The lights overhead began to flicker, casting erratic shadows across the cafe. The background music distorted into a discordant melody, like an old record skipping. I looked around, expecting others to share my concern, but they remained unperturbed. I was alone in my awareness of the unsettling occurrences unfolding around me. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the cafe, extinguishing the candles on each table. Goosebumps prickled my skin as I wrapped my arms around myself, the chill seemingly originating from a corner near the counter. A whispering voice echoed in the air, its words indistinct, but laced with an undeniable malevolence. I strained to make sense of it, my heart pounding in my chest. The words grew louder, and I realized they were repeating a single phrase, "Leave now." Fear surged through me as I pushed my chair back and gathered my belongings. The other patrons remained oblivious, their faces illuminated by the eerie flickering lights. As I reached the exit, the voice grew deafening, a chorus of ghostly whispers urging me to escape. I fled the cafe, my heart racing, and stumbled onto the dimly lit street. I watched in shock as the cafe's windows glowed with an otherworldly light, and a sinister figure materialized behind the counter, a spectral barista with hollow eyes and outstretched hands. I never returned to that Starbucks, and I couldn't bring myself to share my experience with anyone, fearing they would dismiss it as mere imagination. Some things are beyond explanation, and that evening, I had unknowingly entered a realm of the supernatural, a Starbucks haunted by forces beyond our comprehension. I've always been a regular at my local Starbucks, a place where I could find solace amidst the hum of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. But one chilling evening, my love for that familiar cafe would turn into a spine-tingling Starbucks horror story. It was an ordinary autumn night, and I was engrossed in a book at my usual corner table. The cafe buzzed with the chatter of patrons, the clinking of cups, and the soft hum of conversation. The cozy ambience made it the perfect spot to unwind. As the hours ticked by, I noticed an unsettling shift in the cafe's atmosphere. The once lively conversations grew muted, and an eerie hush settled over the room. It was as if a shroud of silence had descended upon the cafe, drowning out the usual sounds. I glanced around, perplexed by the sudden change. The other customers appeared just as perplexed, exchanging uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak up or question the eerie stillness that enveloped us. Then the lights above began to flicker, casting erratic shadows across the cafe. The soothing background music turned into a discordant cacophony, like a broken record playing a haunting melody. A chill crept up my spine as I watched in disbelief. I tried to convince myself that it was just a power surge or a technical glitch, but the events that followed shattered that rationalization. A gust of icy wind swept through the cafe, extinguishing the candles on each table. I shivered and wrapped my arms around myself, feeling a coldness that seemed to originate from a corner near the counter. That's when I heard it, a whispering voice that seemed to come from all directions. The words were indistinct, like a sinister incantation. I strained to decipher them, my heart pounding with dread. The voice grew louder and more distinct, repeating a single, terrifying phrase. "Leave now." Fear gripped me as I pushed my chair back, sending my book crashing to the floor. I gathered my belongings and stood, my eyes darting around the cafe. The other customers remained eerily unperturbed, their faces bathed in the flickering, ghostly light. As I reached the exit, the voice grew deafening, a cacophony of malevolent whispers that urged me to escape. I stumbled out of the cafe, my heart racing, and stood on the dimly lit street, my breath visible in the chilly night air. I watched in terror as the cafe's windows glowed with an unnatural light, and a shadowy figure materialized behind the counter, a spectral barista with hollow eyes and outstretched arms. I never returned to that Starbucks, and I couldn't bring myself to share my harrowing experience with anyone. Some horrors defy explanation, and that evening, I had unwittingly entered a realm of the paranormal, a Starbucks haunted by forces beyond our comprehension. I've always been a creature of habit, and my morning routine included a stop at the same Starbucks before work. But one seemingly ordinary day, that routine would take a chilling turn, leaving me with a Starbucks horror story that defied explanation. It was a crisp autumn morning, and I entered the familiar Starbucks, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft chatter of customers providing a comforting backdrop to my day. I joined the line, exchanging pleasantries with the barista, Sarah, who knew my order by heart. As I waited for my coffee, I noticed an elderly man sitting alone in the corner of the cafe. He had a weathered face and wore tattered clothes, his eyes distant and filled with sorrow. His presence struck me as odd, but I paid it little mind. Minutes later, I received my coffee and settled into my usual spot near the window. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass, casting warm patterns on the floor. I immersed myself in work, the world outside the cafe a blur. That's when it began, an unsettling feeling that something was amiss. The cafe's ambience shifted, the once familiar sounds growing muted. The other customers continued their conversations, but their voices sounded distant, as if they were trapped behind a barrier. I glanced around, perplexed by the eerie stillness that had descended upon the cafe. My gaze drifted to the elderly man in the corner, and his eyes locked onto mine. It was an unnerving stare, one that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, the lights overhead began to flicker, casting erratic shadows across the room. The air grew colder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I could see my breath, a visible reminder that something was amiss. I decided to leave, unnerved by the bizarre occurrences. I approached the exit, but as I reached for the door, it swung shut on its own with a deafening thud. Panic surged through me as I pushed against it, but it refused to budge. I turned to the other customers for help, but they remained oblivious, lost in their own world. I was trapped, alone in a cafe that had transformed into a chilling nightmare. The elderly man in the corner rose from his seat and approached me, his eyes devoid of emotion. He whispered something unintelligible, a string of words that sent a wave of dread washing over me. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the cafe's windows shattered with an explosive force. Glass rained down around me, and a bone-chilling wind howled through the cafe. I felt a force pulling me toward the elderly man, his outstretched hand reaching for me. In a surge of desperation, I broke free, pushing past the shattered windows and fleeing into the street. I never looked back, my heart pounding and my mind filled with terror. I never returned to that Starbucks, and I couldn't bring myself to share my horrifying experience with anyone, fearing they would dismiss it as pure imagination. Some horrors defy explanation, and that day I had unknowingly entered a realm of the supernatural, a Starbucks haunted by forces beyond our comprehension.